This last mini lecture is about cuttings that don't fit very neatly into any of our categories of stem, root, or leaf cuttings. And also it's about plants that produce fully formed plantlets on some other organ of the plant. So we'll start with culm cuttings, which also includes cane cuttings. They're very similar but slightly different. A culm is a flowering stem of a grass, so this is not a normal vegetative stem like we would take a stem cutting of. It's a flowering stem. These are not often used, but they can be used for grasses. So I have some examples here for you, sugarcane and various types of grasses. And basically what you do is you take a segment of that flowering stem, which should have several nodes on it, or at least divisions of some type. You lay it horizontally on the media, and it'll sprout adventitious roots and adventitious shoots from each of those nodes. Now, grasses are monocots, and monocots have to be propagated a little differently than dicots a lot of the time. You'll remember those two subclasses from what we talked about in regard to taxonomy. Now there's a few reasons for this, but basically your monocots, the vascular tissues such as xylem and phloem, are arranged differently. They're just anatomically quite different. And so if it's a grass, we typically call it a culm cutting. If it's some other type of monocot, we call it a cane cutting. So here's an example of a cane cutting. Dracaena is a common houseplant, and I know this isn't a very good diagram, but it gets the main point across. So with Dracaena, you see it grows on these canes, which are somewhat like thick stems. They're not a flowering stem like a culm, so it's a little different, but you propagate it the same way. You can take this cane, cut it into segments that are about 4 to 6 inches long, lay them horizontally in the media, and they will grow new plantlets. Now that's a bit of a drastic thing to do to your houseplant, and you may not be comfortable with that. So in that situation, you can do what they've done in the picture here, which is just to put notches in the cane, and new plantlets will form at each of those notches. So that's cane cuttings, also very similar to culm cuttings, and these are for grasses and other monocots. Here are two monocots that have special asexual propagation techniques. The one on the left is called tufted hairgrass, or, if you'd like to hear a mouthful, the scientific name is Deschampsia cespitosa variety vivipara fairy's joke. So it's both a variety and a cultivar. In any case, what you see in the picture here is what would normally be the flower and seed head of this grass. But for this particular plant, instead of producing seeds, which would be sexual propagation, up in that seed head, it produces plantlets. So each one of those is an intact plantlet. You can just pluck it off and plant it. Now this is interesting because if they were seeds, that would be sexual propagation, and when you planted them, they would yield individuals that were genetically different from each other. But because this particular plant asexually forms plantlets in the seed head instead of seeds, now it's asexual propagation, and each one of those plantlets will be genetically identical to each other and the parent plant. So rather interesting. There's not a lot of plants that do this. The plant on the right is called umbrella sedge. The scientific name is Cyperus alternifolia, although there are other Cyperus species and most of them work. This is an aquatic plant, so in the wild what happens is, as a stem bearing that cluster of leaves gets old, it sort of bends over down into the water, and then a new plant forms down in that leaf cluster and grows on the bottom of the pond or the stream or whatever it is, and then grows up back through the surface of the water vertically. So if you want to propagate this one, what you do is you cut off a stem with the cluster of leaves on it, and you put it upside down either in a jar of water, as they've done here in the picture, or you can plant it in media upside down. But if you do that, just make sure you cover the juncture of the stem and the leaves with media where it won't work. What will happen is a new plantlet will form there and start growing upright from the old upside down cutting. So another specialty type of asexual propagation, and both of these plants are monocots. So like I said, monocots, they just get propagated a little differently. Some plants, and the examples I'm giving you here are dicots, actually not monocots, so it's not just monocots that are different. But some plants produce aerial plantlets on some other part of the plant. As you can see here, we've got a plant that produces those tiny whole plants all along the leaf margins. Now that's the first example there, the Kalanchoe species. There's many species of Kalanchoes and they're a common house plant. And again, the leaf margins are always covered with these tiny plantlets, and all you have to do is break them off and plant them. They already have roots and shoots. Now the common name for this plant is Mother of Millions. I think you can probably understand why. And that's the only problem. If you have this in a greenhouse or in your house with a bunch of other house plants, those plantlets eventually just fall off into the pots of your other plants, and before you know it, you've got quite a bunch of these on your hands. It's not cold hardy outside, so it's not like you have to worry about it taking over your yard, but it might take over your other house plants. The rest of the plants on that list you can see here. So on the top right we have Chlorophytum comosum, our spider plant. It produces these long runners with plantlets on the tips of those. And actually this is also considered a form of natural layering. Layering is our next big unit of information we'll be covering, and so some people would consider this self-layering or natural layering, but basically you've got those runners with aerial plantlets on it. Again, you just cut them off and plant them. The picture in the middle is a plant called piggyback plant. The scientific name is on the previous slide. It's the Tolmia species. But this produces aerial plantlets right where the leaf blade meets the leaf petiole. So again, a completely intact plant will form there. You can pluck it off and plant it. And then in the top left you can see an orchid that does this. A lot of orchids will form aerial plantlets along a stem, and for orchids they're specifically called kikis. Now we'll talk about this a lot more when we talk about orchids. We actually have a whole unit on them. But there are some orchid species that do this, not all of them. Some of the genera that have species that do this are Phalaenopsis, Epidendrum, Oncidium, and Dendrobium. So that ends our unit on leaf, root, and other cuttings.